Hey, this is Mike at Loophole Pedals, and I'm about to show you how I mod the POG2 by Electro Harmonics. For the Tier 1 mod, we upgrade the foot switches and the LEDs. So make sure you like, comment, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you guys in the video.
Alright, so the first thing we're going to do to mod the pedal is to remove the 4 screws on the back. Electro Harmonics uses these new sensor branded boxes, so the threads are really fine and usually really long on the screws. That last screw is stripped out a little bit, so I had a little bit of trouble taking it off. And that does happen from time to time. Now that I've removed the cover, I'm going to go ahead and proceed to the next step, which is getting the screws on the PCB taken off. On the POG2 there are 3 screws, and they're really tiny screw heads on there, so I couldn't use my regular size screwdriver. I've got to pull out the really fine tipped screwdriver that I use for small electronics like opening laptops and whatnot. I just gotten this kit from Christmas as a Christmas present from the family, so this is my first time to really try these out. It's always a good idea to try to hand test and turn the screw by hand first. That way, if your screw head is smaller or larger than your bit, you don't accidentally run the risk of stripping out the head on there. So yeah, there's 3 screws, one in the middle, one in the top left, and one in the top right to take off. Next, I take off everything from the face of the pedal. There are I think there's 8 sliders, or maybe 10 sliders, that have these little rubbery kind of nylon caps on them. And they just pull off really easy. Next, I use this, I forget what it's even called, but I use it to kind of pry off the knob on the pot on the top right there. The bottom of that thing has some felt on it to keep the face from getting scratched off. Next, you'll see me using my rocket socket. Those are plastic injection molded. They hold it pretty well. You can buy them from Pepper's Pedals and at Stompbox Parts. I think they're blue now, but I got in back when they were green. They sell a full set, so it's pretty convenient to use those rocket sockets. The full set includes the sizes for pots and switches and the Footswitches, all kinds of different sizes. Okay, now that those are all loose, the Footswitches will pop right out. I'm going to go ahead and desolder the 2 wires holding on to this Footswitch just to get it out of the way. Those wires are really small, probably like 28 gauge or something, and I don't want it to get messed up while I'm moving the PCB around. Instead of desoldering it, I just add a whole bunch of solder to both pads, and then the wire just pops right out. I'm going to set this aside with its nut to use for a different DIY project. I never use components that have been reused for commercial builds. Next up is to desolder the bypass foot switch. This one's a little bit trickier because it has 9 pads to desolder. And kind of the trick of the way I desolder this is I add solder to the pads first. And it just kind of helps the solder flow a little bit more easily whenever I'm removing the solder. I guess you could try to take a stab at it without adding solder to it, but I always have better luck adding solder first and then taking it away. You could also use flux to help the solder flow better as well, but I just find it easier to use more solder. The type of solder that I use is a no clean Kester silver based solder. Right now you can see I'm emptying out the solder sucker. Make sure there's no residue inside of it or excess little pieces of solder that are going to shoot onto my board as I'm working here. I love these little one-handed soldering vacuums because they are super easy to use, and they just last a long time too. I've used the huge blue and yellow ones before, but you got to use two hands to recharge it, and it gets kind of annoying. So we're going to go ahead and speed up this process just so you don't have to watch me work on this. Alright, so I think I got all the solder off of the foot switch. I'm just going to use a flathead screwdriver to pop this foot switch loose. And as you can see, I'm not having any luck, which means I did not remove all of the solder correctly. It's very careful. You got to be very careful when you're removing the solder, because if you spend too much time heating up the pads can actually lift from the board, and you'll have to do some circuit board repair. So I'm just testing the pads here to make sure which ones I did remove all of it and which ones did not get removed all the way. If I used some flux on this, it would probably be a bit better because the solder would flow a little bit better and be sucked up a little bit better. So I'm just going to go over the pads again one more time just to get any leftover solder off of these pads. This is the thing that takes the most time in the whole project. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward this part too, so you don't have to wait. Alright, we're going to give this another go. And you can see the solder came off a lot easier this time. You just have to take your time with it. Make sure your iron isn't too hot so that you don't burn the traces or cause any circuit board damage. Another way to do this is you could use a hot air gun to heat all the pads at the same time, and then let the foot switch just pop out as well. Just different techniques. I have a couple different tweezers I use. That one is angled. This one I like better for picking up things. I'm going to use this to just kind of move that very hot foot switch out of the way. Remember, I just had a 600-degree soldering iron on it, so even that circuit board right there is hot. You can see me kind of tap my hand on it. Okay, so we need to remove the circuit board now from the enclosure so that we can get access to the inside. The circuit board's not wanting to move. I'm poking around to see what I'm missing. I already removed all 3 screws. It's not moving side to side. It's not moving up and down. And here I figure out that I forgot 2 pieces to remove that are very important. The jacks. Use my rocket socket again to remove the nuts on these jacks. These are called isolated jacks, and you want to make sure you don't screw them in too tight because they do have plastic threads on the inside. Okay, now we can move the board around a little bit. These electroharmonic circuit boards are always very, very tight inside the enclosures. I kind of work it back and forth, being careful with it not to cause any circuit board damage. And after you wiggle it a little bit, it'll come right out of the circuit, or out of the enclosure. So yeah, there is the circuit board. You can see there's a bunch of dust and kind of fuzz on those sliders. So I'm going to clean off that fuzz while we're here. This is also a good time to put any deoxit or circuit lubrication in those faders. I tested the pedal beforehand and there were no scratchy sounds whenever the faders were being moved around. So this one didn't really need any lubrication, it just needed a good dust bunny bustin'. Alright, we're back with the foot switches. We're going to put on the preset foot switch first. This is a momentary single pulse, single throw, soft click, or clickless rather, clickless foot switch. I'm going to pre-tin the pads. On each side, and then we'll attach the wire after that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and add this guy. To orientate it, you see that how the top left and top right pads are jumped together. Feel free to pause the video and check it out. That's the side that this little slot on the shaft of the foot switch is going to go. We just pop it in there. If you have any trouble fitting the foot switch into the pads, just hit it with your soldering iron again and desoldering gun and remove any excess solder on there. I had already done that. We're going to add solder. I'm just making sure I'm holding down with my left hand the circuit board so that the foot switch is flat when I'm soldering it onto the board. I added a little bit of solder on that middle left pad just to get it to be holding by itself. And then I'm going to check just to make sure I soldered it flat. And it is flat. Then I'm going to go ahead and quickly add the rest of the solder to the pads. Remember, if your iron is very hot, not to hold your iron on these pads for too long, or the pad will lift from the circuit board and you'll have to do some repair. Alright, we're going to go back to that preset foot switch. And, oh, this is an important part. You need to remove the nuts before you put the solder on, or else it gets kind of annoying to try to take those off once you're trying to fit the foot switch in the enclosure, as I'll show you later. Alright, that's one wire added in. This second wire, I noticed the wire was starting to get hot, so I'm going to use my tweezers to kind of guide the wire into the pad on the foot switch. That way I don't burn my fingers. Okay. I'm just adding or pulling a little bit on the pad just to make sure that the solder connection is nice and firm. Next, we're going to switch out these LEDs. The stock ones on here are red diffused 5mm LEDs. So we're going to put some nice fresh ones in with a different color to kind of really make it pop. The solder pads are two little pads right next to each other on the other side, and I'm just going to add solder to both pads at the same time and gently pull on the solder bulb, and it's just going to slide right out. Again, I always add solder to things that I want to remove before messing with them. Okay, they popped right out. Alright, here are some blue LEDs. These are also diffused, 5mm, that we're going to add into the pedal for that nice blue modded crisp look. If you do use a smaller size LED, it may not match the size of the hole that's drilled in the enclosure. So usually whenever I replace LEDs, I like to swap the same size for the same size. And just keeping parts in order. I'm going to set that old foot switch aside. So we're going to reuse these standoff spacers. Sometimes they don't want to come off from the old LED, so you just remove the excess solder or move it around a little bit. These are great because sometimes it's difficult to get the distance right of how far from the circuit board the LED bulbs should come out so that they show up on the top of the enclosure. So yeah, I definitely recommend reusing these if possible. They kind of save you a step in having to guess how far from the enclosure that the tops of the LED bulbs should be. I'm just going to fit these in to see which direction they're supposed to go. They are polarized. One side is negative, one side is positive. All LEDs are. So I'm just going to power up the board. It's a low voltage, so it's not going to hurt anything. Just make sure you're not shorting out any critical components. And you do have to clear out the solder from the pads. The pads are very, very small, so it shouldn't take too much effort to remove the solder. Sometimes these can be stubborn, but fortunately in this video, the pads were not being stubborn at all. The solder came right out. Okay, I'm just going to make sure, because the pads are so small, sometimes it's hard to see if they're cleared out or not. And here you can see the light shining in from underneath the board, so I do know that the pads have been cleared out of solder. I couldn't remember which side the LEDs were supposed to be in, so if you can't read, there's a silk screen on the circuit board to tell you which side it should be on. But if you don't understand that, just a quick way to test is which side it's supposed to be. Just flip the LED around and you'll see one way it'll power on and the other way it will not power on. So you can see that it didn't power on that side. So I'm going to flip it over and it powers on. So I know to solder them back in place in that orientation. Now whenever you solder on a circuit board, you definitely want to make sure you disconnect the power, just to prevent anything from getting messed up. Your soldering iron is grounded, or should be grounded, but it's still just good practice to remove power whenever you're soldering on a device. Very carefully add solder to both sides, all four pads, and make sure you don't nick any of the circuit pieces, the components, on the board, or you're going to have a lot of trouble. Make sure that the LEDs are standing up straight, they're not crooked at all. You can see me just kind of bending them lightly into position again. And I'm going to test it one more time just to make sure both lights come on. It's good practice to test anything after you've soldered it, just to make sure it's continuing to work. Okay, next I'm going to cut off the extra traces. I love these wire cutters. These are flush cutters. They have a built-in wire stripper on the bottom. These are my favorite for trimming things down. Next step is to fit it back in the enclosure. If you made it this far, congratulations, you have modded your pedal. In this case, congratulations to me, I guess. I did forget a step when I was about to put this back into the enclosure. There's these little locking washers that help the foot switch from moving or rotating with use. These are especially important on jacks where you're plugging um, wires into them, like the power jack and audio jacks. But in this case, we're going to add these locking washers to both of the foot switches. I'm going to orientate the board or the whole thing upside down so that that locking washer doesn't fly off whenever I'm trying to fit this shaft into the enclosure. Next, I have a little washer to put on there, and then a nut goes on top. This is how I do pretty much all my pedal builds and mods. Whenever I'm replacing foot switches, is I use that locking washer, a smooth washer, and then a nut. I just like the way it looks on the top. It's just very clean looking. I don't really use those plastic washers, those white nylon washers like some pedal guys do. I like the metal, the clean metal look. This foot switch didn't come with a locking washer or a star washer or whatever you want to call it, but I did have one handy just lying around. The orientation of this foot switch clashes with the board there, so I actually have to rotate it around to get it to fit back in the enclosure. And there we go, same process. We're going to use a smooth washer and then a nut on top. You can already see the blue LEDs on there right there. They look really clean. I like them more than the red ones. They stand out, they pop, and it gives that custom boutique modded look. Next, I like to try to make the two foot switches the same height, just as more of a symmetric look. This is just something I do for preference. You don't have to do it if you like one to be taller than the other. In order to achieve this, you need to make a nut in there to control the height of the foot switch. And sometimes it takes a couple tries to get it right, to get the heights matching. As you'll see, I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward this. I'm just adjusting the height of the nut until both sides are about the same height. Alright, now that we've gotten the foot switch on there good and tight, I always hand tighten them first, and then I'll tighten them with the rocket sockets in a minute. We've got to put the screws back on, the 3 screws in the middle, and then we also need to add in the side jack nuts. I'm just making sure that everything is fitting properly with these Electro Harmonix pedals. Sometimes you have to kind of push the board around a little bit to get that power jack to fit in that milled square hole in the top of the enclosure. Everything seems to be fitting pretty well until I got into this piece right here. The screw wasn't wanting to set in straight, it kept wanting to be crooked, and that's because the circuit board was not completely lined up with the screw hole inside the enclosure on the other side. So if that happens, unscrew the screw, move the board around a little bit, and try again. You never want to try to force the screws in, or else you can risk stripping something out. Sometimes when you tighten down the foot switches, they'll want to rotate inside on you, so I'm just holding the foot switch from the inside and tightening it down nice and snug. And again, I'm plugging it in just to make sure all the lights come on and the foot switches are functioning properly before I get more of the nuts and caps on there. It's always a good idea to continue testing the pedal as you're working on it, just to make sure everything is functioning properly. As I said before, these nuts on the jacks, just do them hand tight. You don't really have to tighten them super tight because those metal threads can eat into the plastic threads and mess up your jack. So just do it hand tight is plenty good. Here I also made another mistake. I put on that knob without realizing that there is another nut to go on that potentiometer, and I'll go back and use that that tool to pry it off again. I've seen guys use spoons and screwdrivers and all kind of things to prop off stubborn knobs from potentiometers, but whenever you do, just make sure it has some type of felt on it to prevent your graphic on your enclosure from getting scratched or marred. And there we go. You can see I missed the nut. I forgot about that. So there we go. Just making it hand tight, and then I'm going to tighten it down with my rocket socket. With every pedal that I build in mod, I always sign and date the inside just to document what was done on it and when and by who is a little artist signature. So you can see me write Of course, we got the 4 screws that go back on the back side. Sometimes they can be stubborn. These enclosures are die cast from a factory, so they don't always line up perfectly. So sometimes you got to kind of play with it a little bit to get the lid to line up just right. Alright, they're all back together, and here is my signature sticker that you'll see on every mod that I do. And there we go, mod complete. Thank you guys for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Have a good day.